I arrived at the countryside Airbnb late in the afternoon. The sky was a soft gray, and the air had that clean, earthy smell you only get when you leave the city behind. The house looked like it had been there for decades, a large two-story structure with ivy crawling up one side, wooden shutters painted a pale blue, and a porch that creaked underfoot. I had rented it to have some time to myself, to write and disconnect from everything, to get a few quiet days without the noise of emails, notifications, or people constantly asking for something. When I walked in, the place was quiet in a way that felt heavy, almost like it held its own breath. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and I noticed a faint smell of wood polish and something else I couldn't place. It was faint but distinct, like someone had just been there moving around. The first thing I did was set my bag down in the main living area. It was large and open, with a high ceiling and big windows looking out onto rolling fields. A thin layer of dust lined the edges of the floor, and I could see the faint tracks of someone's shoes on it, heading toward the kitchen. On the table in the center of the living room was a small notebook. I hadn't seen it listed anywhere in the Airbnb description, so I picked it up out of curiosity. The cover was plain, a soft brown leather, worn at the edges, and when I opened it, the first few pages were blank, but then I noticed the handwriting. Neat, small, precise. I flipped a few pages, and suddenly I froze. The entries described my day. They were written in the past tense, as though someone had been watching me. Had a cup of coffee from the kitchen, opened the laptop and read the new chapter of the novel, went out to the porch and stared at the fields. I sat down heavily in the chair, my stomach tightening. I hadn't told anyone where I was staying, let alone what I had done that day. My fingers trembled slightly as I turned the pages. Every little detail was there. The way I had arranged the pens on the desk, the exact angle I had tilted my chair, the clothes I had chosen to wear. It wasn't like a diary of general thoughts. It was specific, precise, and it mirrored my actions perfectly. I told myself it must be some kind of coincidence, maybe notes left by a previous guest that somehow aligned with my habits. I tried to shrug it off. I sat down with my laptop, determined to start writing. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the wind rustling through the trees outside. I kept glancing at the notebook on the table, feeling a growing unease, but I wanted to convince myself that it was nothing. That night, I went to bed early, the room dim except for a small reading lamp. I left the notebook on the table where I had found it. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds and the soft light of dawn spilling across the floor. I went into the kitchen and made breakfast, careful not to think about the notebook. I tried to focus on my writing, but every few minutes I found myself glancing at it. When I finally opened it again, I nearly dropped it. The entries had changed. They described things I had done in private moments that no one else could have known about. Simple things at first, which music I had played, what I had eaten, how I had arranged my papers. Then more personal details started to appear. Memories I had never spoken about aloud, things I had thought were buried. A childhood fear, a small mistake at work, a conversation I had had with someone years ago that I hadn't told anyone. I set the notebook down slowly, my hands shaking. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't sleep well that night. Every little sound made me flinch. The wind against the windows, the floorboards under the weight of the house settling, the creak of the stairs. I tried to ignore it, tried to concentrate on writing, but every time I looked up, my eyes went straight to the notebook. It was like a quiet reminder that I wasn't alone in that house, even though there was no one there. By the second day, I stopped trying to convince myself that it was coincidence. The notebook now included thoughts I hadn't even fully formed yet, things I had been thinking about that morning, things I had written in my own journal the night before, which I had left at home. I couldn't figure out how anyone could know these things. The idea that someone had been secretly living in the house, watching me through the windows or hidden cameras, crossed my mind, and it made me physically shiver. I didn't want to look around for evidence. I didn't want to see anything, but I also couldn't ignore the notebook. By mid-morning, I had made a decision. I packed my things quietly and efficiently, leaving the house exactly as I had found it. I didn't take the notebook with me, didn't even touch it again. I left the door unlocked, left the keys on the table, and walked to my car. The drive away from the house felt long. Even though it wasn't far, my mind replaying every moment I had spent there. Every small action, every glance, every thought I had seemed recorded, watched, remembered. I didn't contact the host immediately. When I finally did, I described the notebook and the entries. The host said it was just a journal from the last guest, that they had left it behind accidentally, and that it was not unusual for guests to leave things behind. I didn't argue. I didn't explain why I found it impossible to believe. I just ended the call, my hands still shaking, and tried to calm myself on the drive home. In the days that followed, I kept thinking about the house, about the notebook, about the feeling of being watched without seeing anyone. I kept checking my surroundings more carefully, noticing every reflection in a window, every stranger who walked past my apartment. It took weeks before I could sit down and write without looking over my shoulder. I never went back to that Airbnb, and I never stayed anywhere in that area again. I stopped looking at Airbnb listings in that countryside, stopped thinking about booking a quiet place to write. The notebook, if it was still there, was someone else's problem now. I told myself that I had done the right thing by leaving immediately. Even though I never saw anyone, never found any cameras, never discovered how they could have known what I was doing or thinking, I left, and that was enough. Eventually, I started writing again, but I chose public places, cafes, libraries, spaces where there were people around, and I could see them. I realized that my need to be alone, to disconnect completely, had left me vulnerable in a way I hadn't considered. The notebook had reminded me how exposed even the smallest details of my life could be, and I never wanted to feel that again. It became clear to me that some spaces, no matter how quiet or secluded they seemed, weren't safe in ways you couldn't immediately see. I still think about that notebook sometimes, about the strange precision of the entries, about the quiet way it invaded my life without anyone speaking to me or entering my room. I know it was real. I know it wasn't coincidence. And I know that leaving immediately, was the only way to make sure it couldn't follow me further. The house still exists, somewhere in the countryside, waiting for the next guest who wants peace and quiet. And I imagine it will always have that notebook, silently recording, patiently waiting, until someone notices the small details of their own life creeping onto its pages. I rented a large house for a weekend with a group of friends. It was advertised as entire house, private, and it looked perfect in the photos, spacious, modern, with high ceilings and big windows that let in a lot of light. There were 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a large living room, and a kitchen that looked almost brand new. The yard was fenced, and there was a patio with a grill. The price was high, but it felt worth it for a weekend away from the city. When we arrived, the house looked exactly like the pictures. Everything was clean, the beds were made, and there was even a welcome basket with snacks and bottled water. We all spread out, claiming rooms and unpacking our things. The living room had a big leather couch, a huge TV, and a fireplace. I remember thinking how quiet it was outside, how the house seemed completely isolated even though we weren't far from town. That night, we stayed up late watching a movie, laughing and drinking wine. The night was calm, and eventually, we all went to bed. Around 2 a.m, I woke up to a faint noise. At first, I thought it was one of my friends moving around, maybe getting a drink of water. The sound was soft, almost like shuffling, coming from the living room. I tried to ignore it at first, assuming it was my imagination. Then it happened again, louder this time. Something was definitely moving around out there. My heart started racing. I shook one of my friends awake, whispering that I thought someone was in the house. We listened, completely still, straining to hear. The sound stopped for a few minutes, then I heard it again, a subtle scrape on the hardwood floor near the couch. We grabbed our phones and flashlights and slowly walked toward the living room. The main lights were off, but the moonlight through the windows lit up the room just enough to see the furniture. Nothing seemed out of place. The couch cushions were in the same position as before, the coffee table was untouched, and the TV was still off. We checked every room downstairs. The doors were all locked, the windows closed. No one was there. Every corner of the house we could see was empty. It didn't make sense. We were all wide awake now, our nerves on edge. I called the host. I explained what had happened, trying not to sound hysterical. He reassured me over the phone that the house was empty and that no one else had access. He said he had changed the locks recently, and only we had the keys. He said it was probably just the house settling, or maybe a branch hitting the window outside. I didn't believe him, but there wasn't much else to do. We tried to get some sleep again, though it was difficult. Every little sound made us tense. Footsteps, creaks, even the wind against the windows sounded suspicious. The next morning, we woke up early. The sunlight was pouring through the big windows, making the house look completely normal again. I was relieved for a moment, thinking maybe it had just been a bad dream. But when we went into the kitchen, something caught my eye immediately. The dishes from last night were gone. The counters were wiped clean. The trash was taken out. It looked as though someone had been in there recently. On the counter was a small note written in pen. "Enjoying your stay?" The handwriting was neat but unfamiliar. My stomach dropped. None of us recognized the writing. The note wasn't signed. We didn't speak much at first, just stared at the note in disbelief. How had someone gotten in? The lock should have prevented it. We checked all the doors and windows again. Everything seemed secure. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken locks or shattered glass. Whoever had been in the house had done it carefully, silently. We didn't eat breakfast. We packed our things quickly, moving as a group. The house that had felt perfect and welcoming the day before now felt threatening. Every corner seemed sharper, every shadow heavier. We left the house as quickly as we could. None of us wanted to hang around, even for a minute longer than necessary. On the drive back to town, we were quiet. The excitement of the weekend getaway was gone, replaced with a creeping unease. We didn't talk about what had happened much, just occasionally glanced at each other, thinking about the note. I kept picturing someone inside the house while we slept, moving quietly, watching us without our knowledge. Later that day, I contacted Airbnb. I explained everything in detail: the noises, the empty house, the note, and our immediate departure. They took the situation seriously and started an investigation. A few days later, they informed me that the host had a history of allowing others access to his rentals while guests were staying there. It was part of a larger pattern of complaints from other renters, some reporting items missing, others reporting the same unsettling experiences. Airbnb apologized and offered a full refund, along with compensation for the stress and disruption. After that, I couldn't stop thinking about the house. The images of the note and the thought of someone moving quietly in the living room stayed with me. I double-checked locks in every other rental I ever booked. I became careful, almost paranoid, about security. I realized that the sense of privacy we had expected was not guaranteed, even when advertised. The weekend had been ruined, but I learned a harsh lesson about trusting hosts and the importance of being cautious. Eventually, I started to feel some relief knowing that it hadn't been supernatural, that it was a real person with real motives, and that Airbnb had taken action to prevent it from happening again. The experience stayed with me for a long time, a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that private doesn't always mean safe. I never went back to that area, and I never booked a house without confirming its security measures personally. The fear faded slowly, but the memory of that note, and the thought of someone in the house while we slept, never completely left me. The lesson was clear: privacy is fragile, and not everyone respects it, no matter how perfect a place looks online. We learned to be vigilant, to trust our instincts, and to act immediately if something felt wrong. The weekend getaway, meant to be relaxing and fun, had turned into a wake-up call. Every detail, from the creaking sounds at night to the note on the kitchen counter, reminded me that real danger doesn't need ghosts or fantasies. It just needs someone willing to ignore the rules and invade your space. I never forgot it, and it changed the way I approached rentals forever. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. After months of working long hours and never really taking a break, I decided to book an apartment in the city for a couple of nights. The listing looked perfect, modern, clean, and with big windows that let in a lot of light. The photos showed a neat living room, a small kitchen, and a bedroom with a tidy bed and soft-looking linens. The price was reasonable, and the location seemed ideal. I wanted a quiet place to write, read, and just step away from everything for a bit. The first few hours after arriving were exactly what I expected. I carried my bag inside, set it down by the door, and walked through the apartment, taking in the space. Everything looked fine. The floors were clean, the furniture in good condition, and there wasn't any visible dust or dirt. I unpacked a few things, set up my laptop on the small desk near the window, and even boiled some water for tea. It felt calm and ordinary, like any other weekend in a city apartment I had rented before. Then, as I started to settle in, I noticed it. A smell. At first, it was faint, almost as if I was imagining it, but it was there, subtle, chemical, and metallic. I stopped typing and sniffed the air, trying to locate where it was coming from. I checked the kitchen first, thinking it might be leftover food in the trash or the sink. Nothing. I opened the fridge. Everything was fine, nothing out of place. I went around the apartment, opening cabinets, checking the bathroom, even lifting the lid on the washing machine. Still nothing. I tried to ignore it at first, thinking maybe it was just some cleaning chemicals that hadn't fully aired out, but by the evening it had grown stronger. The metallic edge of it made my stomach turn slightly. I opened all the windows and doors, letting in the evening air. I sprayed air fresheners I had brought with me, wiped down surfaces, and tried to clean everything I could reach, hoping it would make a difference. It didn't. No matter what I did, the smell remained, thickening in certain corners of the apartment. By nightfall, it was worse. It had settled in the bedroom, heavy and almost suffocating. I tried to distract myself by reading and watching some videos on my laptop, but I couldn't concentrate. The smell clung to the air, to the sheets, to the carpet, and I felt a kind of creeping nausea that only got worse the longer I stayed there. Eventually, I worked up the courage to look under the bed. I had hoped it was nothing, just dust or some forgotten item. What I found made me gag instantly. A plastic bag, partially torn, with something decomposing inside. The smell hit me like a punch to the stomach. It was the source, and it was worse than I could have imagined. I stumbled back, holding my hand over my mouth and heaving. I couldn't believe someone had left this in an apartment that was being rented out, in a place that had appeared so clean in photos. My mind raced. How long had it been there? How had the cleaners missed it? And worst of all, how many people had stayed here and never known? I vomited in the bathroom, then washed my hands over and over. The smell lingered on my skin, on my clothes, no matter how many times I scrubbed. I called Airbnb immediately, explaining the situation and demanding that I be moved or refunded. The host's response was dismissive, telling me it was probably just trash the cleaners had missed, refusing to take responsibility or offer any compensation. It felt surreal, like I was trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I couldn't stay in the apartment. I gathered what I could, leaving behind most of my things, and drove to my car, parked on a nearby street. The night air outside felt like relief compared to the apartment, but I couldn't sleep. I sat in the driver's seat with the windows cracked, trying to calm my nerves and get my mind off what I had seen. The smell still clung to my clothes and hair, and I kept thinking about the bag, about how long it had been decomposing, about what else might be hidden in corners I hadn't even checked. I tried to distract myself with my phone, scrolling through social media and reading articles, but everything felt distant, unreal. As the night went on, I felt exhausted but too tense to actually rest. I kept checking the clock, counting down the hours until morning, when I could finally go somewhere else, somewhere clean and safe. I didn't want to think about who had stayed there before, or how it had been allowed to remain in a city apartment. Every small noise outside, the rumble of traffic, the distant siren, even the rustle of leaves in the wind, made me jump. I felt exposed, like the apartment and its hidden secrets had followed me out into the street. When morning came, I went to a nearby coffee shop to collect myself. The warmth and normalcy of people around me, of clean air and regular smells, helped a little. I called Airbnb again, this time just to report the incident officially, to make sure it was documented. The staff were more sympathetic, and they assured me they would investigate and remove the listing if necessary. But it didn't undo the stress, the nausea, or the fear that someone had so carelessly left a decomposing bag in a space meant for guests. I spent the rest of the day moving between my car, the coffee shop, and a small hotel I eventually booked. I didn't want to go back to that apartment to retrieve my things. I left them there, too disturbed to return. Even after showering and changing clothes, I felt a lingering tension, a caution about every rental I might book in the future. That apartment had seemed safe and normal in photos, but the reality had been completely different. It took me a long time to shake the memory of that smell, and I found myself checking the floors, under beds, and in corners much more carefully in every Airbnb I rented afterward. I also became more cautious about hosts and listings, reading every review and questioning every detail. I never stayed in that city apartment again, and I never forgot the nauseating metallic chemical odor or the horrifying discovery under the bed. It was a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that sometimes even a place that looks clean and perfect on the surface can hide something deeply wrong underneath. Eventually, I returned to normal routines, but I never stopped thinking about that weekend. The smell, the bag, the feeling of being trapped, it stayed with me. And though it was over, though I had escaped and found safety, the experience made me more careful, more aware, and more grateful for the simple things. Clean air, a safe bed, and a place I could trust to just be myself. I booked a loft in the city for a weekend escape, thinking it would be a quiet, easy getaway from the constant noise and stress of work. The listing looked perfect, modern, clean, with exposed brick walls and large windows that let in a lot of light. The photos showed a tidy space with a simple layout, a small kitchen, a living area with a TV, a bedroom tucked in the back, and a bathroom that looked sleek and new. I paid the fee and confirmed the booking, imagining myself relaxing there for 2 nights, catching up on reading, and maybe watching a few shows without interruption. I didn't know how wrong I would be. The day I arrived, the street outside was busy, but not overwhelmingly so. I found the building easily, and buzzed the host to let them know I was there. A few minutes later, the door clicked, and I stepped into a dimly lit hallway. The loft was on the 3rd floor, and the elevator barely fit 1 person and a small bag. The hall smelled faintly of cleaning solution, and the paint had tiny cracks, but nothing seemed off at first. When I entered the loft, it looked exactly like the photos. The floors were polished wood, the furniture was minimalist, and the space smelled faintly of something like lemon cleaner. It felt almost sterile. I started unpacking, placing my clothes in the small closet and setting my bags in the corner. The kitchen was modern but compact, and I made a quick note to grab some groceries on the way back. That's when I started noticing little things that didn't feel right. The living room TV was mounted on the wall, but it seemed awkwardly off-center. I hadn't paid it much attention at first, thinking it was just a stylistic choice. I went to plug in my laptop and shift the TV a bit, just to make it easier to see from the sofa. That's when I saw it. Behind the TV, almost perfectly hidden, was a tiny lens embedded in the wall. It was small, round, almost like a pinhole camera, angled in a way that it faced directly toward the bed. My stomach dropped, and my hands shook. I stepped back and stared at it, trying to convince myself it was just some kind of decorative element. But no, this was deliberate, and it was watching everything in the bedroom. I felt a wave of panic I had never felt before. The idea that someone could have been recording me, or worse, had access to watch me whenever they wanted, hit me with full force. I grabbed my phone and called Airbnb immediately. I explained the situation in short bursts because I couldn't stop shaking. They assured me they would escalate the issue and get back to me, but the host was unreachable. No one answered when I tried calling them, and the email on file bounced back. I felt trapped in that apartment. Every sound outside suddenly felt louder. Every shadow in the corners of the loft made me jump. I didn't want to stay, but I didn't know if I could leave safely with my things alone. I started packing my bags in the dark because the loft's lights felt too exposed, too revealing. I pulled out the clothes I had just unpacked, shoved them back into my suitcase, and moved quickly from room to room. I kept glancing at the TV, imagining that lens recording me even as I scrambled. My heart pounded in my chest, and my hands trembled so badly that I dropped a bottle of water, which rolled under the bed with a soft clink. I didn't dare reach for it. While packing, my mind raced. How long had the camera been there? Had it been there since the loft was first listed? Who had access to the footage? Could they have watched me the moment I walked in? Or had they been recording every weekend before me? I felt violated in a way I couldn't describe. The thought of someone watching me in my private moments, someone who had carefully hidden a lens, made me feel exposed, like I wasn't even in control of my own body anymore. By the time I had everything packed, my chest hurt from holding in so much anxiety. I checked the loft one last time, sweeping my gaze over every corner. Everything seemed normal, but the thought of that tiny lens hidden behind the TV lingered. I didn't dare touch it. I left the loft as quietly as I could, carrying my bags down the narrow staircase, trying not to think about cameras or lenses, trying to focus on the cold air outside, the busy streets, the fact that I was leaving. Once outside, I called a rideshare and didn't look back. The car smelled faintly of the city, exhaust fumes mixed with rain, and the hum of the engine and tires on wet asphalt was almost comforting. I sat there, staring out the window at the passing lights, trying to calm myself. My hands were still shaking, my stomach tight, but I felt a little safer. I kept checking my phone, expecting some message from Airbnb or some notification from the host, but there was nothing. Airbnb eventually refunded the booking after I sent them pictures of the hidden lens. They promised to investigate and remove the listing. I didn't go back. I didn't even want to think about that loft again. I told myself that I was lucky to have noticed the camera before anything worse happened, but it didn't erase the feeling that someone could have had access to my privacy for days or weeks before. Over the next few weeks, I kept replaying the situation in my head. I thought about the small things I had ignored, The oddly positioned TV, the slightly skewed picture frames, the faint hum that I had assumed was part of the building's ventilation. Everything seemed innocent until that camera. I realized that it could have happened anywhere, in any rental, and that made me even more uneasy. I started double-checking listings, reading reviews more carefully, asking for photos from multiple angles, but the sense of vulnerability stayed with me. I eventually booked a small hotel for my next weekend trip, something that felt secure and familiar. The room had a safe, and the staff was visible, with key cards and cameras only in public areas. I slept without fear, but the memory of the loft lingered. I still think about it sometimes, the way that tiny lens could have captured moments I would never forget, moments I wanted to keep private. I never saw the host again, and I will probably never know who had access to those recordings or for how long. The experience changed the way I think about travel rentals. I now check every nook and cranny when I arrive, and I trust my instincts. If something feels off, I leave immediately. What I learned the hard way is that privacy isn't guaranteed, and a place that looks clean and modern in pictures can hide secrets you would never expect. I tell myself that I got out safely, that I was careful, but the sense of exposure never fully disappears. I still think about that loft, the hidden camera, and the thought that someone could have been watching me, and I shiver every time. I know now that even a weekend getaway can turn into a nightmare, and the only control you really have is being alert and leaving as soon as you feel something is wrong. I had been craving a break from the city for weeks. The constant noise, the crowded streets, the feeling of everyone's life pressing in on me. It had become suffocating. When I found the listing for the small cabin on Airbnb, it seemed perfect. The photos showed a rustic little house tucked into a forest clearing, with a wooden porch and windows framed by climbing ivy. It looked isolated enough that I could finally disappear for a couple of days, unwind, and forget about the city. I booked it immediately without thinking twice, eager to be alone and surrounded by nature. The drive was long, winding through back roads and forests I hadn't noticed on the map before. The air changed as I left the town behind. It became cooler, sharper, and carried the scent of pine and damp soil. The cabin appeared just as it had in the pictures, sitting slightly off the road, surrounded by dense trees. A thin layer of fog clung to the ground. It gave the place a quiet, still feeling, almost like the forest itself was holding its breath. The host was already there when I arrived. He was a middle-aged man, his clothes plain and practical, with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. He showed me around quickly, walking at a pace that didn't invite questions. The living area was small but cozy, with a wood-burning stove, a sofa that looked soft despite the years of wear, and shelves filled with mismatched mugs and books. The kitchen was functional, the bathroom clean. Everything seemed fine, except for the door at the end of the narrow hallway. It was old, with peeling paint, and locked. I asked about it, trying to sound casual, but he only laughed nervously and waved me off. He said it was just storage, and that I didn't need to worry about it. There was something in the way he said it, something that made me hesitate, but I didn't push. I didn't want to make a scene, and the rest of the cabin felt perfectly safe. That first evening, I tried to settle in. I lit the stove and made a small dinner, enjoying the quiet hum of the forest outside. The sun dipped behind the trees, and the shadows grew long across the floorboards. I kept glancing toward that locked door, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Eventually, I told myself to relax, to enjoy the solitude, and I went to bed early, exhausted from the drive. Around 2 a.m, I woke up to a faint sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, brushing against the walls or rattling the windows. Then I heard it again, more clearly, soft shuffling, like someone moving carefully across the floor, and a low whispering I couldn't make out. My heart jumped into my throat. I sat up slowly, straining to hear. The sound was coming from the locked room at the end of the hallway. I froze, waiting to convince myself it was an animal or the wind, but the whispering continued. It was deliberate, human. My first instinct was to call the host, but when I dialed, there was no answer. My fingers shook as I texted him. No reply. I tried calling Airbnb, but their message was the same. They couldn't reach him. I felt trapped in a panic that grew by the second. My rational mind screamed at me to leave, but my legs felt heavy. I tried the door. Locked. From the inside, the realization hit me hard. Someone or something was in there, and they hadn't expected me to discover it. I glanced around the cabin for a weapon. There was a fire poker by the stove, and I grabbed it, trying to make myself feel more in control. I knew I had to get out. I put on my jacket over my pajamas, grabbed my bag, and moved quietly toward the front door. Every step felt loud in the silent cabin. I opened the door, stepping into the cold night, the air biting against my skin. I didn't look back at first, just ran down the porch steps, my shoes sinking slightly into the damp soil. After I was 10 feet away, my curiosity, or maybe fear, forced me to glance back. The window of the locked room faced the front of the cabin. Through the thin curtains, I saw movement. Someone or something was standing there, shifting slightly, watching me leave. My stomach turned over. I ran faster, not looking back again. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, breath ragged and chest burning. The forest seemed alive around me, the trees whispering with the wind, the fog thickening so that I could barely see. I kept moving, my mind racing. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to be somewhere with people. After what felt like an eternity, a small gas station appeared through the fog. I stumbled in, drenched in sweat and shaking, and explained my situation to the attendant. He listened quietly, nodded, and gave me a phone so I could call a friend to pick me up. While I waited, I tried to calm myself, telling myself that I had escaped, that I had gotten out before anything worse could happen. When my friend arrived, we drove back slowly, both of us silent. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, scanning the trees, half expecting to see someone following. Nothing appeared. We reached the nearest town, and I finally breathed easier. The city lights a strange comfort after the oppressive quiet of the forest. I reported the incident to AIRBNB the next morning. They took it seriously, launched an investigation, and eventually confirmed that the host had multiple complaints against him for keeping unauthorized occupants in his properties, sometimes without the knowledge of the renters. It was horrifying to think what could have happened if I had stayed another night, alone in that cabin. The entire experience stayed with me for weeks. Every time I closed my eyes, I remembered the soft shuffling, the whispering, and the movement behind that curtain. I realized how lucky I had been to leave when I did, to escape before things escalated further. I avoided remote rentals for a long time after that, sticking to more populated areas, places where help was closer. I never looked at that cabin again, and I didn't want to. The memory of it, the locked door, the host's nervous laugh, the whispering from the dark, was enough. It was a reminder that appearances could be deceiving. That sometimes, even in places that seemed cozy and safe, danger could be lurking behind a door you weren't supposed to open. I had wanted solitude, peace, and nature, but what I got instead was a very real, very human threat that reminded me how carefully you have to choose who you trust, and how quickly things can turn when you let your guard down. After reporting the host, AIRBNB removed the listing, and they ensured it would never be rented out again. It offered some closure, though it never erased the fear of that night completely. I learned to trust my instincts, to pay attention to the subtle signs that something isn't right, and to value safety over convenience or picturesque surroundings. That cabin became a lesson more than a memory, one I carried every time I considered another remote getaway. A reminder that real danger doesn't need ghosts or myths. It just needs someone willing to hide behind a locked door and wait. Even now, months later, I still remember that moment, standing on the porch, seeing the faint movement behind the curtain, knowing I was being watched. The relief I felt when I finally got to safety is still vivid, and the image of that locked room lingers every time I hear the shuffle of footsteps in the quiet. I don't dwell on it constantly, but I never forget. The experience changed how I travel, how I approach solitude, and how deeply I appreciate the safety of a world where the people around you can be trusted.